Rick Gates, an associate of Paul Manafort, the former Trump campaign chairman, in April. Damon, WinterThe, New York Times, Washington. Rick Gates followed Paul Manafort to Eastern Europe, Africa, the Trump presidential campaign, and now a federal building where he surrendered on Monday to the FBI. Mr. Gates, 45, is a former business associate of Mr. Manafort, the ousted chairman of Mr. Trump's presidential campaign, who also turned himself into the FBI on Monday. The men are charged with money laundering and violations of tax and foreign lobbying laws. They are the first to be charged in a special counsel investigation that has dogged Mr. Trump's first year in office. Mr. Manafort has been charged with laundering more than $18 million to buy properties and services. Mr. Gates has been accused of transferring more than $3 million from offshore accounts. Both men are charged with making false statements. The indictments are the first in the long-running investigation of Mr. Trump's associates and possible ties to Russian interference in the 2016 election. Mr. Trump has railed against the special counsel investigation. On Monday morning, Mr. Trump said in a Twitter post that the charges had nothing to do with the Trump campaign, adding, "There is no collusion, sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign." But why aren't crooked Hillary the Dems the focus? Donald J. Trump at Real Donald Trump, October 30, 2017. Also, there is no collusion. Donald J. Trump at Real Donald Trump, October 30, 2017. Separately, an early foreign policy advisor to Mr. Trump's presidential campaign, George Papadopoulos, pleaded guilty on Monday to lying to the FBI about a contact with a Russian professor with ties to Kremlin officials, prosecutors said. A protégé of Mr. Manafort, Mr. Gates survived the Manafort exodus from the campaign and went on to have a central role in Mr. Trump's inaugural committee and a lobbying group that was formed to advance the president's agenda. Mr. Gates was forced out of that lobbying group in April amid questions about Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. As part of the scheme, Manafort and Gates repeatedly provided false information to financial bookkeepers, tax accountants and legal counsel, among others, the indictment said. Attempts to reach Mr. Gates on Monday were unsuccessful. If convicted of money laundering, the most serious charge, Mr. Gates and Mr. Manafort could face up to 20 years in prison. Mr. Manafort had been under federal investigation on suspicion of violating tax law, laundering money and whether he appropriately disclosed his foreign lobbying work. As Mr. Manafort's business associate, Mr. Gates' name is listed on documents that are linked to companies Mr. Manafort's firm established in Cyprus for payments from politicians and businesspeople in Eastern Europe, according to records reviewed by the New York Times. When the business partners worked in Ukraine, Mr. Gates flew to Moscow for meetings with associates of a Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska. Mr. Gates and Mr. Manafort met years ago when Mr. Gates was interning at Mr. Manafort's Washington consulting firm, Black, Manafort, Stone, Kelly. The firm was known for running Republican political campaigns and then lobbying the politicians after they won their elections. In Washington, Mr. Manafort was known for representing dictators and strongmen, such as Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines. Mr. Manafort also represented the Trump Organization to lobby the Treasury Department regarding casino transaction rules. Mr. Gates would later follow Mr. Manafort to a new firm, Davis Manafort, which worked on the campaign of Viktor F. Yanukovych, the pro-Russia former Ukrainian president. This work connected the men with Mr. Deripaska, an aluminum magnate and ally of President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia. Mr. Deripaska has been denied a visa to travel to the United States because of allegations that he is linked to organized crime operations, charges Mr. Deripaska has denied. In 2008, Mr. Gates took over the firm's duties in Eastern Europe, where he worked on business development and contract negotiations. And this work could be lucrative. Mr. Manafort was a multimillionaire with vacation homes in Palm Beach, Florida, and the Hamptons. In 2007, Mr. Gates and his wife sold their home in Richmond, Virginia, for $700,000 and took out a $1.5 million loan for a house in one of the city's wealthier neighborhoods, according to public records. That same year, Davis Manafort embarked on a new venture, a private equity fund created to buy small companies in Russia and Eastern Europe. Mr. Deripaska was the biggest investor in the fund, called Pericles. Mr. Gates has said he read news reports about Mr. Deripaska and his visa problems, but they did not raise concerns for him. "We thought we had a good business model," Mr. Gates has said. "We thought we were going to be successful." The fund floundered and the one deal with Mr. Deripaska turned into a legal dispute. The fund also raised red flags for investigators, particularly the transactions that flowed through offshore accounts in Cyprus. According to handwritten ledgers found in a former office of Mr. Yanukovych political party, payments totaling $12.7 million were made to Mr. Manafort in undisclosed cash transactions between 2007 and 2012. Other documents suggest that one payment that was earmarked for Mr. Manafort was paid through an offshore bank account. Mr. Manafort has said that the ledgers are forgeries and that he never received secret cash payments. Davis Manafort used shell companies to process payments for its political and business activities. Mr. Gates was one of the employees who worked with a Cypriot law firm that registered these companies, according to documents reviewed by The Times. Russian oligarchs and businesses have been using Cyprus as a tax haven for years. Mr. Gates has said he was told that the firm's clients instructed Davis Manafort to use accounts in Cyprus for money transfers. The special counsel, Robert S. Mueller III, said Mr. Gates used money from some of these offshore bank accounts to pay for his mortgage, the tuition for his children's education and decorating his home. According to public records, Mr. Gates lives in Richmond. In early 2014, Mr. Yanukovych was ousted from power, sending Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates to look for new political clients. The client search ultimately led them to the Republican presidential primary race in the United States. Mr. Gates followed Mr. Manafort to the Trump campaign in the spring of 2016. Mr. Gates managed many of the campaign's daily operations and often traveled with Mr. Trump and others working on the campaign. After the election, Mr. Gates went on to help run Mr. Trump's inaugural committee and later a lobbying group that raised money to advance Mr. Trump's agenda. But federal investigators remained interested in the work Mr. Gates did with Mr. Manafort. Mr. Mueller said that the men made tens of millions of dollars as a result of their work in Ukraine and that they worked to hide the payments for about a decade. The two men laundered the money through scores of United States and foreign corporations, partnerships and bank accounts, the indictment read. Kitty Bennett contributed research.